Part 1. At 18, Granda's life was like a rusted blade, dull, useless, and ready to snap under the slightest pressure. For the inhabitants of the Iron-Tooth clan, this age was the time of initiation, when yesterday's teenagers turned into warriors capable of shedding others' blood for the prosperity of their lords. Granda was not a warrior. She was the daughter of Grot, a blacksmith whose lungs were soaked in coal dust so deeply that even after death he seemed to continue exhaling gray smoke. When Grot passed away 2 years ago, Granda was left alone in the forge, which was her whole world. In the Iron-Tooth clan, craftsmanship meant nothing if your hands didn't hold the hilt of a battle-axe. To them, the forge was merely a place for manufacturing death, and Granda, who spent her nights calculating stress loads on steel and studying the blueprints of old masters, was just a frustrating nuisance. That day began with an ash-gray dawn, which always heralded trouble in these lands. The clan's square, paved with heavy basalt slabs, was filled with hundreds of people. They stood in a tight ring, creating the feeling not of a wall, but of a living, pulsating organism, ready to tear apart anyone Elder Vrot pointed at. Vrot was the embodiment of clan cruelty, calculating, cold, and devoid of the slightest hint of compassion. He didn't like noise. He liked the silence of obedience. When Granda was led to the center of the square, she didn't tremble. She kept her back straight, just as her father had taught her when they forged metal together. His words, "Stand firm when the hammer strikes the anvil, otherwise you won't feel the vibration," now echoed in her mind. She stood firm. Vrot began to speak. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if he were reading off a list of provisions rather than deciding a person's fate. "You haven't brought the clan a single victory," he said. "You waste valuable coal on toys that will never cleave an enemy. You are rust on the body of our people. From this hour on, the forge falls under the control of the armorers, and you are free from your obligations to your kin." This wasn't just an exile. It was the stripping of her name. In their world, banishment meant death, because beyond the clan's protective walls lay lands full of dangers, wastelands, and madness. She was given an hour to gather her things. She returned to her forge. This place breathed with memories. The cooled hearth, the vise where metal for her first knives was once clamped, the smell of burning that had become so dear to her. She didn't cry. She didn't have time for that. She opened the stash under the anvil, where she kept her most valuable possession, a set of precision instruments forged by her grandfather. She wrapped them in oiled leather and packed them into her old backpack. A couple of spare shirts, a supply of dried roots, and the very hammer she had forged herself went in as well. She didn't take any of the clan's goods. Not a single ingot, not a single piece of iron. She walked out of the forge empty-handed, but with something no one could take from her: the memory of how to make metal speak. She walked out the gates as the sun was already beginning to set. The road led through scorched earth. She knew that heading to the cities was a path to nowhere. No one was waiting for her there. She headed toward the zone of oblivion, a territory where battles were once fought and where no one had set foot for 30 years. It was there, rumor had it, that abandoned goblin factories stood, having turned over time into legends of cursed places. Granda didn't believe in curses. She believed in physics. She believed that even the most powerful mechanism couldn't simply cease to exist unless it was destroyed down to the atom. By midnight, she reached the edge of the wasteland. The landscape here was apocalyptic. Twisted remains of machinery, blast craters overgrown with thorny bushes, and the skeletons of buildings turning black against the starless sky. It was there, a couple of miles from the main road, that she saw it. A massive, dilapidated hangar, its roof gaping with holes, and its walls looking like the ribs of a giant beast. It stood aloof, surrounded by a halo of silence. To anyone else, it would be a place to spend the night, where one could perish from the cold or a marauder attack. To Granda, it was a place where she could start building what the Iron-Tooth clan had never understood. She slipped inside through a breach in the wall. The air inside was stale, heavy with dust and the smell of decay. But as soon as she lit a torch, she realized this place wasn't abandoned in the usual sense. It had been left in a hurry. Blanks lay on the workbenches. Tools that would be considered a fortune in her native clan were scattered on the floor. Granda put down her backpack. She wasn't homeless. She was in her new forge. She began by examining the structure. The hangar was designed using principles Granda had seen in her father's books, but could never test in practice. The load-bearing beams were set at an angle that minimized vibrations, and the foundation had deep shafts for heat dissipation. She realized this place wasn't just a garage, it was an industrial hub. And even if there were no active engines left, the structure remained. Structure is where all creation begins. She slept on her backpack, covered with an old tarp she found in the corner. That night she dreamed that the hangar walls began to shift, adjusting to her breathing. It was a strange feeling, as if the place acknowledged her. The next morning, she sprang into action. She needed to start the lighting system. She knew that in such buildings, power was usually supplied through a central node that had to be protected from destruction. She found this node in the center of the hangar, hidden beneath a layer of concrete dust and rubble. It was a massive cast-iron box, locked by a complex mechanism. Granda didn't try to break it. She spent hours studying every ridge on its lid. It was a puzzle. For those who didn't know how gears worked, it was unsolvable. But Granda knew. She felt the resistance of every mechanical component. She began turning the levers, listening to the clicks inside the box. A click, another, and on the third, a deep, visceral sound of a working relay. Something inside the box sprang to life. She stepped back. Suddenly, with a sharp hum, emergency lamps lit up under the hangar's ceiling. The light was dim, yellowish, but to Granda, it was brighter than the sun. The entire hangar came alive. Copper veins stretched along the walls, beginning to glow with a barely perceptible warmth. She realized the hangar was powered by geothermal sources deep underground, and as long as the earth continued to move, the hangar could keep working. She wasn't just an orc girl from an exiled clan. She was a master who had turned on a machine that had slept for decades. The moment she saw that lighting, she felt the weight of her responsibility to the clan fall from her shoulders. She no longer needed Vrot's approval. She no longer had to justify preferring a hammer to a sword. Now, she had a workshop unmatched in the entire region. She knew she would face difficulties in the coming days. She needed to find food, fortify defenses, and search for spare parts. But this was hers, her personal empire, built on ruins that no one valued. She sat on a workbench, wiped the sweat from her forehead, and smiled. This was the beginning of something that would forever change the balance of power. She didn't know exactly how yet, but she knew for sure she would do it. She would fix everything, every part, every node, every system. And when she was finished, the world wouldn't be able to ignore her existence. She began reassembling the first tool. Her fingers confidently gripped the handle, and she started working, not noticing how time dissolved in the endless process of restoration. She wasn't just building a workshop. She was building the foundation for her new life, where every strike of the hammer was an affirmation of her right to be who she always wanted to be. This was the first day of her real life, a life she created with her own hands from what everyone else called dead garbage. And now this garbage had become her greatest strength. She began drawing the first sketches of her future creations on the walls using pieces of coal. She knew this hangar would become the birthplace of the future, and her first task was to create an energy source that would make this place completely autonomous and unreachable for anyone wanting to come here with weapons. She was ready for this long road, and every step across the hangar was a step towards freedom, towards the understanding that true power lies not in conquest, but in the ability to breathe life into what was doomed to oblivion. She felt the hangar answer her with a quiet hum, and this hum was the only sound that mattered most to her right now. She was a master, and a master is never lonely if they have work that changes the world. And now she set to this work with redoubled strength, understanding that every screw she put in place would be her personal answer to those who decided she was nothing. It was the beginning of a great restoration, and Granda knew that no one and nothing could stop her now. She picked up an old wrench lying on the floor and confidently began unscrewing the first rusted nut on the distribution system's main shaft. The work had begun, and in this rhythm lay all her future power, her entire calling, and everything that would make her a legend of these forgotten lands. She didn't know that in a month the whole town would come to her asking for help. But she knew for sure that everything she did would be built to last. For she was putting into every node not just iron, but the meaning of her struggle for the right to be herself, for the right to create where others could only destroy. And this feeling was stronger than any clan law, any threat, and any injustice. She worked all night, and by morning her eyes saw not just a pile of junk, but a complete system she was going to launch in the coming days. And this confidence was as unshakable as the steel she had worked with all her life. Part 2. Work in the hangar consumed Granda entirely. Over the following weeks, she turned into a shadow moving between the racks with the grace of a predator, hunting for the right parts. Her hands, always bruised and oily, became her primary tool of discovery. She no longer felt like an exile. She felt like an explorer who had stumbled upon an inexhaustible archive of knowledge. Every day she discovered new horizons of technology. Old goblin blueprints she found deep in the archival boxes were written in a language she understood intuitively. It was the language of logic, pure calculation, and mathematical elegance. She realized the goblins who built this hangar didn't just erect walls. They created a life support system capable of functioning autonomously for decades. But something went wrong. Something that forced them to leave, abandoning everything. She started finding traces, not just rust, but signs of damage that couldn't be explained by random wear and tear. Deep scratches were visible on some parts, as if the metal had been struck by something monstrously heavy and sharp. But the hangar still stood, and that meant the defenses she had activated on the first night were just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the concrete floor, deep in the basements, transformers hummed, still trying to contain the energy inside. Granda understood. She had to reach the very heart of the system. She began breaking a path through the central part of the floor. It was heavy work, requiring not only strength, but jeweler-like precision. She used pneumatic hammers she found there, connecting them to a compressed air system she restored from the remains of compressors. After 3 days of labor, a hatch protected by a magnetic lock opened before her. Granda didn't try to break it. She felt the magnetic field vibrating under her fingers. She began reconfiguring the coils inside the lock, creating a countercurrent. It was a dangerous game, The slightest mistake could lead to an explosion of the energy accumulator. But she saw the lines of current. She felt the tension in every wire, and when the lock opened with a dull click, she felt a rush of triumph she had never known in the clan. Inside was a small room bathed in soft blue light. In the center, on a pedestal, lay an object that changed everything. It wasn't a mechanism in the usual sense, but a kind of core controller encased in a transparent sphere. As she approached it, the sphere began to pulsate. Granda felt a current run through her body, but it wasn't a shock, it was a data transfer. Images, schematics, numbers, and methods of processing materials unknown to any clan forge raced through her mind. She realized this was the complete archive of goblin engineering knowledge. They left it here as a message, as a legacy for the ones smart enough to find and start the system. Granda placed her hands on the sphere. In that moment, she realized why she had been exiled. She wasn't just a blacksmith. She was someone whose mind was made to understand such things. She was the true heir to the knowledge meant to save this world from stagnation and wars. She began transferring the information into her notebook. She drew blueprints for new types of drives, methods for creating alloys that wouldn't rust for centuries, and schematics for defense systems that could turn her hangar into an impenetrable fortress. She worked around the clock, barely eating, barely sleeping. She felt herself changing. Her understanding of the world deepened. She began to see the world not as a collection of hostile clans, but as a massive, broken machine that needed fixing. At the end of the 10th day, as she was finishing the data transfer, she heard a sound. It wasn't the hum of a generator or the dripping of water. It was the sound of footsteps on the hangar's concrete floor. Heavy, measured, confident footsteps. Granda froze. She turned off her lamp so as not to give herself away and listened. Someone had entered the hangar. "I know you are here," a voice rang out. It was quiet, metallic, devoid of human warmth. Granda slowly climbed the stairs from the basement. She held her hammer, ready to strike at any moment. She stepped into the central hall and froze. It wasn't a clan warrior standing before her. It was an automaton. A tall creature of black metal, its joints covered in glowing articulations. Its lens eyes looked straight at her, evaluating her every move. This was the hangar's guardian, awakened when it sensed someone touching the core. "You are not a goblin," the automaton stated. Its voice sounded like grinding metal. "You are an orc. Why are you here?" Granda didn't lower her hammer, but there was no fear in her voice. "This place was abandoned," she replied. "I came here to make it alive." The automaton tilted its head, emitting a series of clicks that sounded like data analysis. This place was not abandoned. It was waiting for those worthy to continue the great creation. I am Keeper 7. I was activated after you started the main power circuit. You performed work that our creators considered impossible for a creature of your species. Granda felt pride swell within her. My species are those who do the work, not those who seize what belongs to others. I am here to build. Keeper 7 stepped closer. Its movements were flawless, devoid of any unnecessary motion. To build, in this world that strives only for destruction. Why? Because it's the only way to survive, Granda answered. We can't just fight forever over scraps of iron. We must learn to create what makes life worthwhile. The automaton fell silent, processing her words. The light of the hangar lamps reflected in its lenses. If you want to build, you will need more than just a hammer and iron. You need resources. You need recognition. And you need time to prepare for what will come from the outside. What will come from the outside? She asked. Those who fear change, the keeper answered. The Iron-Tooth clan already knows what is happening here. Vrot will not leave you in peace. Your activities disrupt their balance of fear. They will come to take this core, and they will not stop at murder. Granda looked at her hands. They were covered in oil and soot, but they were strong. Now she knew she had an ally hundreds of times stronger than any warrior in the world. Let them come, she said. We have time to prepare. Keeper 7, I want you to teach me everything you know. I want to turn this hangar into something that will make this entire region tremble at the realization of what they lost when they cast me out. Keeper 7 made a gesture, inviting her to the main terminal. Then let us begin. We have work that should have been finished 30 years ago. They began working together, Granda and a machine created to protect secrets that were meant to change this world. Days merged into one continuous motion. She learned to control complex systems. She taught the Keeper to understand human, or in her case, orcish, motives. She realized that the world wasn't as simple as it seemed, and that the power held by the elders rested solely on the fact that people didn't know how the tools controlling them worked. She started designing autonomous defense systems, not to kill, but to stop those who came with aggression. She used the energy accumulated by the hangar to create pressure fields that could throw back anyone who dared approach the gates. She created tools that were dozens of times more efficient than any factory equipment. City folk started coming to her more often. At first, it was just craftsmen needing advice. Then farmers joined them, needing help with irrigation. And then entire families flocked to the hangar. Granda couldn't refuse. She saw how her knowledge was changing their lives. They no longer depended on clan supplies. They became independent. By the end of the second month, the hangar was no longer just a workshop. It was a settlement. Houses, gardens, and workshops sprang up around the hangar. Granda created something that had never existed in these lands, a society based on labor, not force. She felt her power growing, and with it grew her responsibility. She knew Vrot was watching her. She knew he was gathering his forces, but now she didn't care. She was ready. She stepped onto the hangar roof and looked at the horizon. Where there was once emptiness, there were now lights. The lights of a settlement she had saved from oblivion. She knew a battle lay ahead, but she also knew that standing beside her in this battle would be not just a clan, but an entire civilization she had resurrected from the ashes. "Are you ready?" The voice of Keeper 7 sounded nearby. Granda picked up her hammer. "I've been ready since the moment I was kicked out the gates," she said. "And now they will understand exactly what they lost when they decided I was nothing." She knew the game had begun, and she was going to win it by her own rules. At her disposal was not just a hangar. At her disposal was the full might of technologies that could bring this world to its knees or raise it from the ruins. And she chose the latter. She would build until every person in this world understood that freedom is not a gift, but the result of the work you do every day, no matter what. She was the blacksmith of her destiny, and her steel was now the strongest in the world. Part 3. The news that the useless orc girl had turned a pile of rusted junk into something providing light and independence to entire settlements spread across the Iron-Tooth clan lands like wildfire. Vrot was furious. To him, the existence of such a place was a personal insult, a challenge to his years of rule built on fear and total resource control. He couldn't allow anyone but himself to distribute goods and decide who lived and who starved. At dawn on the 31st day after Granda activated the main core, the clan's main forces approached the hangar. This wasn't just a reconnaissance mission, it was a punitive core. 200 warriors clad in blued steel, with siege engines used for tearing down fortress walls. Granda stood on the upper deck of her hangar, watching the gray field before the gates turned black with enemy banners. Beside her stood Keeper 7. Its metal plates glowed faintly in the morning gloom, and its lenses continuously scanned the approaching threat. Granda felt no fear. She felt a cold, calculated clarity. In her hands was the control terminal she had built over the last 2 weeks. It wasn't a hammer. It was a system connecting her will to every defense node she had managed to install. "They intend to burn everything to the ground," Keeper 7 said. Its voice was calm, devoid of evaluation, but Granda caught a warning in it. "If we use the network's full power, the core might overheat. A discharge of the accumulated potential will be required." "Let it overheat," Granda cut in. "We won't let them in. We didn't build this just to let them tear it down in an instant." Vrot rode forward. He looked older than he had a month ago. What he saw, light in the hangar windows, smoke rising from the chimneys, people who no longer hid but looked at him with defiance, was driving him mad. "Granda!" he roared, his voice echoing over the field. "You have made the biggest mistake of your life. You stole clan property and rallied traitors around you. Come out right now, and maybe I will let you die quickly." Granda pressed the communication button, and her voice, amplified by the powerful speakers they had mounted on the roof, thundered so loudly that the warriors' horses began to back away. "Vrot, the time for threats is over. You came here for property, but there is nothing here that belongs to you. Everything here was created by the labor of those you cast out. This is ours, and if you take one step closer, you will see what technology is capable of when it's directed not at destruction, but at defense." Vrot waved his hand. The siege engines creaked, launching heavy stones toward the gates. Granda didn't flinch. She knew how these machines worked. They relied on the force of tension and leverage. She knew their weak points. She pressed the activator. A force field suddenly flared up around the hangar, an invisible dome generated by decommissioned crystal blocks she had reassembled. The stones slammed into this dome and, losing all kinetic energy, simply crumbled into useless dust. The warriors froze. They hadn't expected this. They expected a fight, but they were faced with something beyond their comprehension. Vrot ordered the infantry to launch a frontal assault. 200 screaming warriors rushed toward the hangar. Granda slowly raised her other hand. She activated the soil vibration suppression system, the very one she had found in the stash's schematics. The ground beneath the attackers' feet suddenly became soft, like quicksand. The warriors began to sink, losing their balance, dropping their weapons. "This is physics, Vrot," Granda shouted. "You came with steel against the mind." She didn't mutilate them. She gave the command to Keeper 7. Directional pressure emitters extended from hidden panels in the hangar walls. They released a short, focused pulse of sound waves. It was like the invisible strike of a giant hammer. The warriors were simply thrown back, without suffering lethal wounds, but stripped of any desire to continue the fight. They fell, lost their helmets, and their formation shattered in seconds. The battlefield turned into chaos. Vrot tried to rally the survivors, but they were demoralized. They saw how a single strike, a single breath from the hangar, stripped them of their advantage. Granda wasn't killing. She was teaching a lesson. She showed them that power based on creation is invincible. "Leave," her voice thundered again, "and never return. Otherwise, next time I won't use warning systems." Vrot looked at his defeated army. His eyes burned with hatred, but something else appeared in them. Fear. He realized that this girl, whom he had tossed aside like a useless object, had become a threat he could no longer control. He turned and rode away without a word. His warriors trailed behind him. The battle ended before it had even begun. When the dust settled, Granda lowered her hands. She was pale, her hands shaking from the strain. Holding the force field had cost her immense effort after all. She turned to Keeper 7. "We did it," she said. "Yes," the automaton replied. "But Vrot will return, with greater forces, or with treachery. He is not one to admit defeat." Granda knew that. But she also knew they had changed the rules of the game. They were no longer just exiles in a hangar. They had become a political force. People from the city, who had been watching the battle from shelters all this time, began to emerge onto the field. They had seen the clan warriors flee, and now they looked at Granda not as a strange orc, but as a savior. She began to build the network further. Now she knew that defense wouldn't be enough. She needed to give the people tools so they could defend themselves. She opened a workshop for anyone willing to learn. She started teaching local craftsmen the basics of goblin engineering. She passed on the blueprints from the archives. Now every house in the city could have autonomous lighting, water purifiers, and filtration systems. The city began to flourish. Trade revived. No one depended on the will of the clan elders anymore. Granda felt the hangar growing around her. It was no longer just a hangar. It was a university, a factory, a fortress, and a home to hundreds of people. She understood that this freedom came at a high price. Every night she checked the defense systems. Every night she analyzed the reports of her scouts regarding what was happening at the Iron Tooth headquarters. She began creating mobile complexes. These were small platforms that could be deployed anywhere to provide a ready-made workshop or defense system. She equipped neighboring settlements with them. She was creating an infrastructure that was impossible to destroy without destroying the entire region's economy. She became indispensable. And so, a month after the first siege, a warrior didn't come to her door. The elder of one of the neighboring clans, who had never gotten along with Vrot, arrived. He came with a proposal for an alliance. He offered resources, protection, and recognition in exchange for technologies. Granda knew this was the beginning of real politics. But she was ready. She understood that if she wanted to protect her hangar, she had to play by the rules of this world. "I agree," she said, looking the elder in the eye, "but on one condition. No wars, no pillaging, only creation. We will change this world according to the blueprints I have created." The elder nodded. He was surprised by how wisely and thoughtfully this young orc girl reasoned. "You will change this world, Granda," he said. "You already are." She returned to the hangar after dark. She looked at the lights of her settlement. This was her triumph. She hadn't just survived. She had created life where there was only rust and emptiness. She felt the hangar humming in time with her own heart. She knew there were still many battles, many enemies, and many trials ahead. But now she wasn't alone. And most importantly,
Now she knew what she was born for. She wasn't made for a forge that churns out death. She was made to turn on the light where others saw only darkness. She approached the main terminal and opened a new project. It was a communication system project meant to unite all the settlements in the region into a single network. It was something no one could have ever even dreamed of. And she was going to make it real. She was Granda, the master from the Iron Tooth, and she was beginning to write her own story. A story that would live longer than clans, longer than empires, and which would forever remain in the memory of this world as the story of the one who wasn't afraid to challenge fate and build her paradise on the ruins. Part 4. After the threat from the Iron Tooth clan was temporarily neutralized, Granda faced a task of a different order. She realized that holding the defense was merely a passive strategy. To truly secure her settlement and give people a chance at a decent life, she needed to seize the initiative. She didn't need to defeat Vrot in open combat. She needed to render his power useless. And for this, she decided to implement a Project Keeper 7 called the Great Network. Granda started with a deep analysis of the surrounding land's structure. Using the Hangar's sensors, she scanned the entire region, mapping the energy flows.
She discovered that the ancient goblins had laid down a kind of ethereal arteries in these lands, power transmission lines that ran from the mountain ranges to the river valleys. These lines were abandoned and buried under landslides, but they were still functional, waiting for the right connection. Granda set herself an insane task: to restore these arteries and unite all the settlements willing to cooperate into a single power grid. She started by building small transmitters. These were elegant structures made of copper and insulating materials that she and her students installed on hilltops. Outwardly, they resembled tall spires crowned with crystals. When Granda activated the first circuit, a thin golden beam briefly pierced the sky over the wastelands. This was the transfer of data and energy. Now the hangar was no longer the sole source of life. It became a node. Energy began flowing to farms, mining operations, and workshops in neighboring villages. People who previously worked from dusk till dawn in semi-darkness suddenly gained access to clean, stable light and mechanical support. It was a true revolution. The elders of other clans, seeing how their subjects were suddenly becoming independent, initially tried to interfere. They forbade their people from touching the heretical spires. They tried to smash the equipment. They threatened excommunication. But Granda was prepared for this. She developed a defense system for each spire. If someone tried to pry open the casing, a pulse would trigger, disabling all electrical devices within a 100-meter radius for hours. She didn't destroy her enemies. She made their methods meaningless. Elders who came with axes found themselves in the middle of a field where their own swords and armor refused to work, and their warriors lost orientation due to sonic traps. Soon it became clear. Resisting progress was simply unprofitable. The clans that accepted Granda's terms began to thrive. They gained access to tools that made their labor 3 times more efficient. They no longer suffered from hunger because automated irrigation systems, built from the hangar's blueprints, turned lifeless dust into fertile soil. Granda became the mother of the network. That's what the commoners started calling her. To her, it was merely the logical conclusion of the creation process. She saw the blueprints from the tomes coming to life, saw how what had been dry lines on paper transformed into the warmth of homes and the smiles of people. Meanwhile, Keeper 7 became more than just a machine to her. It became her advisor, her teacher, and her only true friend. It processed vast arrays of data, predicting Vrot's behavior, analyzing climate changes, calculating the optimal installation angles for new spires. It taught Granda to see the world in numbers while retaining her orcish instinct for the voice of metal. "Your strength, Granda," it would say during rare moments of pause, when they sat on the hangar roof watching the lights of the network, "is not that you know how things work. Your strength is that you understand why they must be exactly this way. You add a piece of soul to cold engineering. This is what my creators lacked." Granda knew the Keeper was right. She saw the difference. Engineering without a purpose turns into a weapon. Engineering with a purpose turns into life. She was building a city that could exist without masters, without castes, without a constant war for scraps of resources. But the stronger she became, the stronger the threat grew. Vrat realized he couldn't defeat her on the battlefield, so he shifted to a strategy of conspiracy. He began bribing her inner circle, promising them riches and power in a new world where he would once again be the sole ruler. Granda learned about this not from spies. She learned about it from the network itself. She had created a monitoring system that tracked frequency changes whenever someone used energy for selfish purposes. One of her key engineers, a young goblin named Cass, who was among the first to join her, started discreetly diverting part of the power, preparing to hack the entire network. She felt it at night while diagnosing the energy flow. She didn't arrest him. She summoned him to the center of the hangar, under the light of the main lamps. "Why, Cass?" she asked. The goblin trembled. He was terrified, but there was resolve in his eyes. "Vrat said you're creating a system that will make us slaves, that you want to become the empress of these lands yourself. He showed me papers saying the hangar feeds off the life energy of those nearby. I got scared, Granda. I was scared for my brothers." Granda sighed. She knew that lies were Vrat's most dangerous weapon. She walked over to the terminal and brought the entire structure of the energy flows up on the main screen. "Look," she said, pointing at the graphs. "The energy comes from the earth. It isn't taken from people. It doesn't demand sacrifices. Vrat wants us to be afraid because he is afraid himself. He doesn't want you to be free because free people cannot be controlled. If you want to leave, leave. But remember, out there, beyond this network, there is nothing but his tyranny." Cass looked at the screen, at the numbers, at the reality he had tried to destroy, and saw his mistake. He fell to his knees, begging for forgiveness. Granda didn't punish him. She simply said, "Go and fix what you've done. If you are sincere, you will find a way to earn back trust." From that moment, she understood that her main enemy wouldn't be an army, but the fear and distrust Vrat would try to sow among her ranks. She realized that creating technology was only half the battle. The second half was educating people who could use it without succumbing to manipulation. She started holding open meetings. She explained how the network functioned, how every mechanism worked. She wanted every person in her settlement to understand what they had wasn't magic. It was the result of their collective labor. She fought ignorance as fiercely as she fought corrosion on metal. She established an educational system where anyone could come and learn engineering. The city became a place where blueprints were valued over swords, where social status was determined not by the nobility of one's bloodline, but by how much good you brought to society. Vrat was enraged when he found out his attempt to undermine Granda from within had failed miserably. Now he was left alone. His best warriors started defecting to Granda because they saw, there in the hangar, there was meaning, there was life. The moment arrived when she felt she was ready for the final step. She decided she would no longer wait for attacks. She built the beacon of truth, a device capable of broadcasting an audio signal from miles around, covering the entire territory controlled by the Iron-Tooth clan. She was going to tell the people the truth about how Vrot had lied to them all these years. She was going to show them that life could be different. But on the day the beacon was to be activated, as she stood at the control panel, Keeper 7 burst into the hangar. Its lenses flashed red, signaling a critical alarm. "Vrot is coming," it said, "not with a squad, with everything he has. He's leading thousands of people. He wants to burn everything down, even if it kills him." He realized he's losing everything, and decided that if he can't rule this world, no one will. Granda looked at the console. Before her lay a choice. Either activate the beacon and spark unrest within the clan, or throw all her power into defense. But she realized that now was not the time for words. Now was the time for a final, decisive answer. She pressed the key to launch the hangar's entire system at full capacity. Not for defense, but for something far greater. She was going to unite all the spires into a single shield that would cover not just the hangar, but the entire city. She was going to protect everyone. "Keeper," she said, "redirect the energy to the main circuit. Let happen what may. We will let them see what they've been trying so hard to destroy." She watched as thousands of lightning bolts began converging in the sky above them, gathering into a single blinding sphere of light. This wasn't just a defense. It was a demonstration of the power of creation that this world had never seen. And if Vrot wanted to come, he would see that he was trying to wage war against the future itself. The sphere of light over the hangar grew, consuming the twilight. The air around became so thick with electrical charge that everyone within a mile radius felt their hair stand on end and tasted a distinct metallic tang on their teeth. Granda stood at the main terminal, her fingers flying across the touch panels at incredible speed. On the screens, she watched Vrot's army approaching, a black, writhing serpent of thousands of heavily armed orcs moving toward the hangar. Vrot had no intention of negotiating. He brought everything. Siege battering rams, throwing machines, magical amulets he had bought from mercenaries with all the clan's gold. He was obsessed with wiping Granda off the face of the earth. "They are 500 meters away," Keeper 7 said. Its voice grew deeper, carrying notes of tension Granda had never noticed before. "Elder Vrot is using a suppression artifact. He's trying to breach our defensive perimeter on a molecular level. If he succeeds, the network will burn out." "I won't let him do that," Granda replied, clenching her jaw. "Redirect the flow from the lower accumulators. We need to create a zone of turbulence around their formation." She began a series of manipulations that required unbelievable concentration. She had to feel every flow of energy as if they were threads in her own hands. It was as if she were weaving a spider web, but using pure electrical power instead of silk. And suddenly, she felt resistance. Someone inside the network was trying to counteract her. It wasn't Cass, it was someone from the outside, someone who possessed as much knowledge about goblin technology as she did. Vrot had found an engineer. He found a traitor who knew the vulnerabilities of her spires. Granda saw holes beginning to appear in the network. Energy was draining from the defense circuit into nowhere. Slowly but surely, the enemy was deactivating her shields. "Keeper, track the source of the interference," she commanded. The automaton instantly provided the coordinates. The source was located in Vrot's mobile command tent, currently hidden behind the infantry lines. That was where the person hacking her system sat. Granda realized that if she didn't neutralize this transmitter within the next 10 minutes, the shield would fall,
and all her work, the entire city, all these people would be doomed. She made a decision that could cost her life. "I'm disconnecting network control," she said, switching to direct manual targeting of the defense cannon. "Keeper, you take over stabilizing the circuits. If I miss, you must lead the people into the underground vaults." "That is suicide, Granda," the automaton replied. "Direct control will burn out your nervous system." "If I don't do this, they will burn us all out," she replied, rushing to the targeting panel. She didn't listen to objections. She plugged the neural interface into her head. It was the most dangerous experiment of her life. She felt her consciousness expanding, the hangar becoming her body, every spire turning into her arm, and every transmission line into her nerve. She saw the battlefield as no one else did. She saw every speck of dust, every stone, every heartbeat in Vrot's ranks. She felt their fear, their hatred, their blind faith in their elder. She found that very tent. She focused all the network's tension on a single point. The air over the battlefield began to shimmer. Granda felt her own blood beginning to boil, her consciousness tearing under the weight of the data. But she didn't back down. She channeled the most powerful discharge the hangar had accumulated over the month directly into the center of Vrot's command. A deafening explosion rang out. It wasn't an explosion of fire. It was a discharge of pure energy that obliterated the tent, along with the jammer generator and everything inside. Vrot, standing outside, was knocked off his feet by the shockwave. The formation of his army lost its coordination in an instant, but most importantly, all the suppression devices they were using burned out. The protective dome over the hangar flared up with renewed vigor. It became so bright that the clan warriors were forced to cover their eyes. "Now!" Granda screamed, though her voice could only be heard in her own head. She activated the rejection protocol. The sphere of light over the hangar expanded, transforming into a ring of blinding energy that swept across the field. Everything standing in its way, battering rams, siege engines, simply began to dissolve. The energy neutralized the structure of the metal, turning everything created for killing into rusted dust. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing the wasteland inhabitants had ever seen. The Iron-Tooth warriors, seeing their weapons crumbling in their hands, dropped everything and ran. They weren't just retreating. They were fleeing for their lives. Vrot was left alone in the middle of the scorched field, clutching a broken blade in his hand. He stared at the hangar shining like a divine creation, and there was no longer any hatred in his eyes. There was only pure, primal terror. He realized he had encountered something he could never defeat. He realized he hadn't just lost a war. He had lost an era. Granda disconnected from the system. She collapsed onto the floor, feeling convulsions rack her body. Keeper 7 caught her, preventing her head from hitting the ground. "Status critical," it stated, "but the objective is achieved. The enemy is in flight. 0 civilian casualties." She could barely breathe. Every cell in her body screamed in pain. But she heard sounds from outside. People were emerging from their homes. They weren't screaming in fear. They were shouting in awe. They saw the darkness recede. They saw that they were protected not by swords, but by the very impossible that no one but her believed in. She lay on the hangar floor for several hours. When she came to, she saw a crowd around her. Everyone was there. Goblins, orcs, humans, half-elves. They stood in silence, looking at her with an expression she had only seen in old fairy tales. It held reverence for something they couldn't fully comprehend, but which had saved their lives. "You saved us, Granda," said the same half-elf girl who had been the first to arrive. "You did what no one else could." Granda stood up, leaning on Keeper 7.
Her legs were still shaking, but her mind was clearer than ever. "I didn't save you," she replied, looking over them. "You saved yourselves when you decided to stay here and work instead of running away. This hangar is just a tool. The true power is within you." The crowd erupted in noise. They began to thank her. Someone brought water, someone offered medicine. She looked at them and realized the game with the clan wasn't over yet, but now they had the upper hand. They weren't just a settlement. They were the beginning of a new world, a world where labor and creation meant more than pedigree and the power of the sword. The next morning, as the sun began to rise over the horizon, Granda stepped out onto the roof. Before her lay the field where an army had stood just yesterday.
Now there were only the ruins of Rot's weapons. And she understood. Tomorrow they wouldn't come with a sword. Tomorrow they would come with questions. Tomorrow they would come asking for help. And that would be her greatest victory. She looked at Keeper 7. "Did you record that?" she asked. "Every moment," the automaton replied. "It will serve as a lesson for anyone who decides that strength lies in iron rather than the mind." Granda nodded. She knew the story was just beginning. She started designing a new system, not for defense, but for expansion. She wanted to build a school of engineers who would spread this knowledge to every corner of the world. She wanted to ensure no child in this world would ever feel weak again just because they couldn't hold an axe. She wanted everyone to know, if you have hands and a mind, you can build anything. She sat at the terminal. She had a lot to do. She needed to fix the water filtration system, set up communications with new allies, and prepare plans for building a full-fledged city. But now, she had everything she needed. Most importantly, she had the people's trust. And with that trust, she could move mountains. She began to work. The rhythmic strike of the hammer against the anvil, complemented by the hum of the running generators, became the sound of life for this settlement. A sound that proclaimed everything had changed forever. And no one dared call her weak ever again. She was Granda, the one who fixed what was deemed impossible, and the one who built the future on the ruins of the past. Part 5. After Vrot's army retreated, a strange, ringing calm settled over the region. The authorities of the Iron Tooth clan tried to pretend nothing had happened, calling the defeat a tactical retreat in the face of an unknown natural anomaly. But every orc in the district knew the truth. They had seen the blinding light. They had seen their best siege equipment turn to dust.
Vrot's reputation, sustained for decades by fear of his power, began to melt like the first snow under the spring sun. Granda, however, was in no rush to celebrate. She understood that the most dangerous enemy wasn't open aggression, but the envy ripening deep within the clan structures. Her settlement, which she proudly began calling the engineering hub, was developing rapidly. Now, not only outcasts came to her, but also craftsmen from the clan's most loyal families who secretly dreamed of learning what Granda did. She accepted everyone. Keeper 7 developed an application filtration system. They vetted every newcomer not for clan loyalty, but for the sincerity of their intentions. Granda believed that even the most hardened warmonger could become a great engineer if given a tool instead of an axe. "Look," she told a young orc who had come from deep within the clan lands. She handed him the blueprint of a steam valve she had designed for the heating system. "See these lines? This isn't just a drawing. It's the path the energy takes. If you understand this energy's path, you can control the heat of an entire city block. You won't be dependent on whether the elder gives you coal. You yourself will become the one who creates warmth. The orc, whose father had worked in the mines his entire life, merely clutched the blueprint, unable to believe his eyes. Granda saw dignity awakening in people. This was what she strove for most of all: the elimination of dependence. He who knows how to create things becomes free. He who can build a house, provide himself with water and light, has no need for tyrants. In those weeks, she began work on a project that was to become the pinnacle of her mastery: an autonomous power supply module. She wanted to make it so simple to maintain that anyone could assemble it from spare parts lying underfoot. She wanted technology to become accessible, not elitist. Keeper 7 tried to talk her out of it.
Granda, if you make the technology too simple, people will stop valuing it, it said, watching her refine the prototype. They will start using it carelessly. The system will break down in a year. That's the whole point, Keeper, she replied without lifting her head from the table. If it breaks down, they must be able to fix it themselves. I don't want to create dependence on myself. I want them to learn to be creators. My task is not to become a new ruler, but to become the last one needed to start the process. When they learn to create themselves, I will not be needed. And that will be my greatest victory. This stance shocked even those living in her hangar. Everyone was used to leaders holding on to power by keeping people in the dark. Granda did exactly the opposite. She made all her blueprints public, held lectures, and published manuals that spread to all the villages. She became the engineer of the common good. Meanwhile, Vrot, realizing he couldn't crush her with force, decided to use the tactics of intrigue. He began spreading rumors that Granda was working for dark gods, and that her technologies would bring a curse. He tried to convince other clans that she was building not houses, but a machine to enslave their souls. It was a desperate move. An elder who had relied solely on strength his entire life couldn't understand how one could just give knowledge away for free. One night, a saboteur sneaked into the hangar. It was a mercenary sent by Vrot, tasked with blowing up the central reactor. Keeper 7 detected him while he was still on his way. Granda didn't hide. She stepped out to meet this man just as he was reaching for the console. "Do you know what will happen if you pull that lever?" she asked. The mercenary froze. He was young, terrified, and clearly didn't want to be there. "Vrot said there's a bomb here, that if I detonate it, I'll be a hero." Granda walked up to him and placed a screwdriver in his hand. "Open the panel. See what's in there. If you see a bomb, press it. If not, I will answer any question you have." With trembling hands, the mercenary pried open the panel. Instead of wires for a detonator, he saw a complex network of copper coils humming peacefully, pumping energy into the city's water filtration system. He saw filters, temperature sensors, mechanisms that saved lives. He closed the panel and looked at Granda. His eyes were welling with tears. He said you were a monster." "I am no monster," Granda said. "I am just the one who decided we deserve better than endless war. Go home. Tell Vrot you found nothing here but light. And if he wants to come himself, let him come. I will be waiting for him with a wrench in hand to fix whatever is broken in his head." The mercenary left. He didn't return to Vrot. He stayed in the settlement, and he became one of Granda's best students. This incident marked a turning point. Vrot lost the trust of even his most loyal people. When he tried once again to assemble a raiding party, he was met with refusal. The warriors didn't want to march against the one who gave life instead of taking it. Vrot remained alone in his castle, locked away in his hatred and fear of the future he tried so desperately to stop. Granda, meanwhile, continued her work. She realized that the scale of her influence had gone far beyond a single region. Craftsmen from neighboring lands started turning to her. They asked for help building dams, mills, and purification facilities. She created the Engineering Corps, a mobile team that traveled across the region, helping anyone in need. She became the architect of a new order. She turned a rusty hangar into the cradle of a civilization that had no need for old dogmas. Sometimes, in the evenings, she would sit on the roof and watch the sunset. She saw the lights of new cities igniting in the distance. This was the network she had woven from copper and resolve.
She knew that all of this was just the beginning. She prepared a plan to build the first full-scale power plant, which would be able to provide energy even to the most remote mountain clans. She understood this would change everything. It would free people from the necessity of fighting over resources. It would make them builders. Her hands, once stained only by the soot of an old forge, now guided processes upon which thousands of lives depended. She was content. She wasn't seeking fame. She wasn't seeking power. She was seeking a way to prove that if you don't give up, if you don't betray yourself, you can turn even the most hopeless place into a cradle of change. And every time she picked up her hammer, she remembered her father's words. Stand firm, otherwise you won't feel the vibration. Now she felt the vibration of the entire world, and this vibration was the rhythm of her success. She knew there was still a lot of work ahead, but she also knew she had Keeper 7. She had devoted people, and she had blueprints that were stronger than any army. She was ready. She was free. She was the architect of a future that had already begun to arrive. Part 6. Vrot stopped waiting. His pride, fed for decades by the fear of those around him, had turned into a morbid obsession. He was no longer gathering an army. He gathered all those who were too terrified to leave him and those who sincerely believed in the old order. This was no longer an army of warriors, but a mob of people driven to frenzy by deceitful propaganda. On a cold evening, when the sky was overcast with low gray clouds, they approached the walls of the settlement. Vrot was confident of his victory. In his hands was an artifact he had acquired on the black market, the Chain Devourer, a device forged by ancient mages specifically to sever any magical or technological links. He believed this was the key to Granda's downfall. Granda watched their advance through the camera system. She stood in the center of the control room, surrounded by her engineers. Among them were those who had once come to her with the intent to sabotage her work. Now they were her right hand. He has come with the Devourer, Keeper 7 said, projecting a schematic of the enemy device's function. If he activates it at this range, our entire network will experience a colossal power surge. The capacitors might not hold. Let him try, Granda replied. Her voice was chillingly calm. If he wants to use energy against us, we must give him the opportunity to drown in it. She began a series of rapid manipulations. She wasn't preparing for defense in the traditional sense. She was laying a trap. Granda knew that the Chain Devourer worked on the principle of absorption. It drew energy into itself to tear apart the structure of a circuit. She decided to give it something it didn't expect. She ordered all the spires within a mile radius to switch to overload mode. She was going to channel all the accumulated energy of the hangar not into the force field, but straight into Vrot's device. It was risky. If the device worked as intended, they would be left without light and heat for several days. But if Granda's calculations were correct, Vrot's device would explode under its own weight. Vrot stepped into the center of the field before the hangar. He was alone. He knew that if he brought his entire army, Granda would use her invisible force again. He decided to destroy the heart of her settlement himself with his artifact. He raised the chain devourer above his head, and it began emitting black sparks that seemed to consume the very light around them. "Granda!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with rage. "Today, you will see what happens to those who try to rewrite the laws of our world. Technology is for the weak. Strength lies in will and in blood." Granda watched him through the monitor. She saw every spark emanating from the artifact.
She saw the moment Vrot activated it at full capacity. "Keeper, now!" she commanded. She pressed the launch button. In that very instant, all the spires around the settlement flared. Not gold as usual, but a blinding white light. All the hangar's energy, all the resources accumulated over long months, flooded down the line straight to the point where Vrot stood. The artifact in his hands began to glow. First black, then purple, and finally an unbearably bright white. Vrot tried to throw it away, but the device clung to his gauntlet. The sound that followed wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of an entire thundercloud discharging. A massive torrent of energy slammed into the artifact, and unable to withstand the load, it detonated. The flash was so intense that for a few seconds it became high noon in the wastelands. The shockwave knocked down everyone standing in formation behind Vrot. When the dust settled, the field before the hangar was empty. The chain devourer ceased to exist, as did most of Vrot's armor. The elder himself was on his knees, his clothes smoking, his single eye fixed on the sky. He couldn't comprehend how his great power had been defeated by a pile of copper wires and crystalline plates. Granda emerged from the hangar. She walked slowly, not hiding behind the keeper, carrying no weapons. She approached the defeated elder. Hundreds of people from her city gathered around her. They looked at their former leader, who now looked like a broken old man. Vrot looked at Granda. There was no more hatred in his eyes. There was only emptiness. "How?" he asked, barely audible. "You are just an outcast. You have nothing." Granda crouched down beside him. "That was your mistake, Vrot. You thought to have meant owning what could be taken away. You thought power was built on what you forbade others to do. But I realized power is what you create yourself. You lost everything because you tried to protect what was already dead. And we built a future because we didn't need to destroy anything to find our place." Vrot bowed his head. He knew he had lost. Not to an army, not to Granda. He had lost to time. He had lost to the very idea that the world could live by different rules. "What will you do with me?" he asked. Granda looked at her city, at the people who were no longer afraid. "Nothing," she replied. "You are free. Go wherever you want. You are no longer an elder. You are just a man with nothing left to believe in. That is your punishment." Vrot slowly got up. He looked at his former warriors, but they didn't turn to him. They were looking at Granda. He turned around and walked away into the darkness of the wastelands. No one ever saw him again. The victory was complete. But Granda felt no euphoria. She felt relief that it was all over without unnecessary bloodshed. She knew they now faced different challenges.
building a city management system, establishing trade, training new masters. But now she was certain. Nothing would stop this process. The entire region began to change. Clans started sending their representatives to beg Granda for education. They didn't bring tribute. They brought materials. They brought their knowledge, which they had kept secret for years. And Granda established what she called the Council of Masters. It wasn't a governing body, but a community of engineers who solved the settlement's problems through joint efforts. 6 months after the victory, Granda held the first technology exhibition. The city had turned into a center of progress. People came from all over the world to see how those who were once outcasts lived. She welcomed everyone. She showed them how the network worked, how to harvest energy, how to build things that make life easier. She saw her settlement transforming into something beyond all expectations. She saw children who used to play with rocks, now playing with blueprints and model engines. She knew she had laid a foundation that would outlive her. As the day drew to a close, she sat on the hangar roof again with Keeper 7. "We won," the automaton said. "We didn't win," Granda corrected it. "We just opened a door. Now they will have to walk through it themselves." She looked at the sky, which was now filled not with the smoke of fires, but with the light of new communication networks. She was content. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she was certain. If you work with what you have, and stay true to yourself while doing so, there is no limit to what you can create. She picked up a pencil. She needed to draft a project for a new transport system. She was going to bring this world closer together, so that people could communicate, learn, and help each other without knowing borders. And she knew she had every chance of making it a reality. The work continued. The hum of machines, the sound of the hammer, the voices of people, all this became the new symphony of this place. A place that was once a junkyard and became the heart of the world. And she was the one who made that heart beat. Part 7. Years passed. What once began as the solitary survival of an exiled orc girl in a rusty hangar had turned into a legend told around campfires in all corners of the continent. The region, once saturated with the fear and dust of constant strife, was no longer a backwater. Now trade routes ran through it, carrying not caravans with spoils of war, but cargo platforms loaded with blueprints and machine parts. The engineering hub grew into a technopolis city, where the foundation of everything was not the right of the strong, but the skill of the creator. Granda no longer worked in the forge around the clock. Her role had changed. She became what Keeper 7 called the chief architect. She was no longer building individual parts. She was building an education and management system meant to function for decades after she was gone. She founded the Academy of Engineers, admitting anyone, whether orc, goblin, human, or a representative of any other race, who was ready to dedicate their life to creation. The Academy's doors were open to those who understood the ultimate truth. A tool placed in the right hands changes the world more profoundly than a 10,000-strong army. She still frequently visited that very first forge, now the city's history museum. She carefully preserved the very same small hammer that started it all. Sometimes in the evenings, she would sit at the workbench and just listen to the silence. The silence of this city was not an emptiness. It was filled with the hum of working systems, the distant whistle of steam turbines, and the laughter of children running through the streets, unaware of the fear of elders. It was the music of progress. Keeper 7, whose chassis had long since been replaced with newer, more advanced parts,
designed by Granda herself, stood beside her. It had become her faithful companion, the keeper of archives, and the memory of all those who had walked the path from poverty to prosperity. "Granda," it said, "according to my calculations, our region's development level has exceeded projections by 400%. Our societal model has been recognized as effective even by the clans that initially opposed us." Granda smiled. She felt how, with each passing year, her body grew heavier, how her movements slowed, how the strands of her hair turned silver. But inside, she was still that 18-year-old girl standing at the gates, with nothing but the belief that the world could be fixed. "Efficiency is good, Keeper," she replied. "But the main thing isn't the percentages. The main thing is that now no one can come and tell them they are weak or unfit. Everyone now knows they can build their own future." One day, a delegate from the High Council, who had once tried to limit her influence, came to see her. He came not with threats, but with a request for help in restoring the irrigation system in the Empire's capital. Granda looked at him. She remembered the times when people like him called her garbage. She could have refused. She could have made them beg, just as they had once made her beg. But she didn't do that. "We will help," she said, "but on one condition. You will implement our education standards in your schools. You must teach your people not how to obey, but how to think." This was her final and most important condition. She knew that tools could be broken and buildings destroyed, but knowledge embedded in the minds of people could never be eradicated. She was sowing seeds of change that would sprout for generations. In the final years of her life, Granda often retreated to the stash she had found on that very first night. Now it wasn't just a treasury of knowledge. It was an entire museum chronicling how outcasts became the architects of the future. She left a will. The key to this archive was to be given not to her successor, but to anyone who completed the full course at the academy and defended a thesis dedicated to solving a global problem in the region. When her final day came, she sat in a chair on the hangar roof, watching the sunset. She saw the city breathing with life, systems running, people gathering in the central square to celebrate the festival of creation. She was at peace. She knew that everything she had started would be carried on. The people to whom she had given a dream would not let it die. Keeper 7 stood nearby, humming softly as a sign of respect. "Your legacy will not fade, Granda," it said. "I have transferred all data to the main server. Access will be open to every free master in this world." She closed her eyes. It seemed to her that she could hear the strike of the hammer against the anvil that once echoed in her father's forge. Only now, this strike wasn't the sound of slave labor. It was the heartbeat of an entire civilization that had begun to build its future with a clean slate. They didn't bury her under a monument like great warriors. They buried her in the center of the hangar, under the very slab where the core was once hidden, where it all began. And every year, on the day of her passing, thousands of masters from all over the world brought tools they had forged with their own hands. This was her true tribute. Granda's story became something passed down from mouth to mouth. Her story wasn't a tale of defeating an enemy. It was a story of overcoming circumstances. She proved that even if you are cast out, even if you are stripped of everything, even if the whole world is against you, you always have the chance to become the master of your destiny. You always have tools, your hands, your mind, and your desire to move forward, despite any fear. For those of you watching this video right now who feel weak, superfluous, or exiled, remember this path. Granda wasn't special. She was simply persistent. She didn't wait to be given a place in this world. She forged it herself from rust and ash. And if she could do it, then every one of you can too. Because the world doesn't belong to those who build walls to hide. It belongs to those who build bridges, workshops, and cities to unite. Thank you for being with us on this long journey. We have traversed through exile, through the darkness of the wastelands, through sieges, and through a great construction. This story has come to an end, but the story of every one of you is just beginning. Don't be afraid to start from scratch. Don't be afraid to take the rusted iron of your life into your hands and turn it into something that will stun this world into silence. Keep working. Keep creating. And remember, as long as you hold a hammer in your hands, your destiny is solely under your control. Subscribe to the channel. Leave comments. We read your every word.
Tell us, what are you planning to build in your life? Which rusty nut in your destiny are you ready to turn today? This was your storytelling, and we will definitely see you in the next tale. Until we meet again, Masters.